Elias Boone's boots sank into the dry earth as he tightened the last strand of fence wire, the metal humming faintly under his calloused fingers. Evening light stretched long across the ranch, bathing everything in a copper glow. He didn't often pause to admire it. Beauty had a way of cutting deeper than sorrow. Somewhere behind him, an old windmill groaned like a weary soul. Elias straightened slowly, back stiff from years of work, and let his gaze drift toward the distant hills. For a man who lived alone, silence was both a companion and a cage. He rarely rode into town. Ashwood Flats, just 7 miles south, was filled with the kind of noise that reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Laughter, piano music, the sound of boots rushing across saloon floors. He'd once dreamed of bringing his bride-to-be there, of building something more than fences and cattle pens. But fever had taken her before vows were spoken, leaving him with nothing but a single sepia photograph tucked beneath his mattress like a relic. After that, Elias stopped looking for company. He fed his horses before himself, fixed what broke, and let the seasons roll over him like waves on stone. But that Tuesday, the need for nails and salt forced him down the dusty road into town. He rode in at a slow trot, head lowered against the wind. The saloon was already busy by the time his boots hit the wooden planks. He hadn't planned to linger, buy supplies, ride home, avoid conversation. Simple, until the shouting began. "She's not our problem anymore," a rough voice barked from inside. "You can't just leave her out there." A woman's voice, sharp, trembling, desperate. Elias paused at the threshold. Inside, near the bar, Mrs. Whitmore, the widow who ran the boarding house, stood with arms crossed. Her cheeks were flushed with anger, her gray hair tucked messily under a kerchief. "She was treated like an animal," she spat, "sold like a sack of grain." "And when the buyer saw her face," a man muttered from the corner, "he left her to rot." Elias' jaw tightened. He stepped forward just enough for the floorboard to creak. "What girl?" he asked, voice low, steady as the ground under his boots. Mrs. Whitmore turned, startled. "South Road," she said after a moment, 3 miles past the split, just standing there." "Standing?" Elias frowned. "They tied a grain sack over her head. She'd curse any man who looked at her." The widow's voice dropped, heavy with something like pity. "She hasn't moved, she hasn't spoken, except to beg someone to take it off." Elias looked at the sack of nails on the counter. He didn't pick it up, didn't ask another question. He simply nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked out. The horse's hooves struck dry dirt as he rode into the dying light, the sun bleeding into the horizon like a wound. The road narrowed to a ribbon of dust, bordered by scrub and scattered rocks. When he saw her, he almost mistook her for a scarecrow left in the wrong field. She didn't move, didn't even turn her head at the sound of his approach. The sack was tied cruelly tight at her neck. Her dress, a pale, worn thing, clung to her knees, damp from some river crossing or tears he couldn't see. Her hands were bound in front, rope frayed and biting into her skin. Elias dismounted, boots crunching softly against gravel. He stopped a few paces away. "You all right?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She didn't reply, didn't flinch. Only the faintest whisper escaped the burlap. "Please, take them off." Elias stared for a moment, the plea cutting through his chest like barbed wire. His fingers, rough from years of work and war, reached for the knock. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As he loosened the rope, thread by thread, he realized that whatever life he'd been living, quiet, hollow, unchanging, was about to shift in a way he couldn't stop. The burlap fell, and nothing would ever be the same. For a long second, Elias just stood there, the empty sack dangling from his hand. The girl's face emerged from the shadow of the burlap like a secret the world had tried to bury. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't some ghost to be feared. She was bruised, one cut on her lip, a dark blotch near her jaw. But under all that pain was someone heartbreakingly young. Too young to be standing barefoot on a lonely road with nothing but dust and silence for company. Her eyes met his, wide and unsure. She looked as though she was bracing for a blow that never came. Elias swallowed hard, lowering the sack. "You want to come inside?" he asked, though there was nothing around but open fields and the darkening sky. She blinked once. "I don't need pity." "You don't have pity," he replied quietly. "You've got blood on your foot." Her gaze fell to the ground. A jagged cut on her heel was oozing, red against pale skin. She didn't answer. Elias stepped closer and extended his hand. She didn't take it, but she followed when he turned back to the horse. By the time they reached his ranch, night had settled in. The cabin stood small and weathered, a single lantern glowing in the window. Elias dismounted first, tying the reins to a post. He turned to help her down, but she'd already slid off, stumbling slightly. Without a word, he pushed open the door and led her inside. The air smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. A stone hearth burned low, throwing a warm flicker across the log walls. Elias motioned toward a chair by the fire. "Sit," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that wasn't unkind. She hesitated, arms wrapped around herself, as though she might vanish if she let go. Finally, she lowered herself onto the chair. Elias fetched a tin cup, filled it with clean water, and handed it to her. Her hands shook so badly that half the water spilled onto her lap. He didn't comment, just crouched near the fire, pulling a boiled potato from the pot hanging over the embers. He placed it on a plate and set it on the small table beside her. "Eat." The girl stared at the food, then at him, as if trying to understand why he wasn't asking for anything in return. Slowly, she picked up the potato and took a bite. Her lips trembled, not from the heat, but from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with hunger. For a while, there was only the sound of firewood popping and the wind pressing against the walls. Then she spoke, her voice fragile. "They gave me to him," she whispered, as though admitting a sin. "The man who bid highest, but he didn't want me after." Elias didn't look up. "Because of your face?" She shook her head slightly. "No, because I didn't speak. They said I was a curse, that I'd bring ruin if a man looked too long." Elias exhaled through his nose. "That's not how curses work." A flicker of something like a smile touched her lips. "My name is Clara," she said. He nodded once. "Elias." Clara brought her bound wrists closer to her chest, rubbing them gently where the rope had left angry marks. "I don't want to curse you." "You won't," he said simply. But as Elias looked at her, really looked at her, he felt something shift. The silence of the cabin, the quiet rhythm of his life, all of it felt different now, as if someone had opened a door he didn't know was locked. He glanced at the burlap sack folded neatly near the hearth. It seemed smaller now, just fabric and thread. And yet it had carried a weight heavy enough to crush a person. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grass. Inside, Clara finished the potato, her eyes fixed on the fire, as if waiting for it to tell her she was safe. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The first night, Clara barely touched the bed Elias prepared for her. She sat near the hearth, legs pulled close, like the fire was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Elias didn't ask questions. He'd learned a long time ago that silence could heal faster than words. Instead, he left a tin cup of water on the table and stepped outside to split firewood. When he returned, she'd drained half the cup, but still hadn't moved from the floor. By morning, the girl looked less like a shadow. Her face, though bruised, held a spark that hadn't been there the night before. Elias boiled water, poured it into a small tin basin, and set it near the fire. "For your hands," he said simply. She hesitated, then dipped her fingers into the warmth. The rope burns were raw, angry marks circling her wrists, but she didn't flinch, not this time. She glanced at him as though trying to read the man who had brought her here. "You live alone?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Horses and fences keep me busy enough." Clara didn't press further. She picked up a piece of cloth, a faded scarf that must have belonged to someone before her. It was deep red, the color of sunsets. She wrapped it around her wrists, not just to hide the wounds, but as if the fabric itself offered a kind of armor. Elias noticed, but said nothing. There was something in the way she held that scarf, like it was the last piece of herself the world hadn't taken. As the hours passed, Clara started to eat. First half a potato, then a slice of cornbread Elias had baked days before. Each bite felt like defiance, like proof she was still alive. He caught her eyes once, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by the hunger that made her hands tremble. Outside, the land lay quiet beneath a soft wind. Elias led the mare to water, his mind replaying fragments of the night before. There was something about Clara's silence that unsettled him. Not because it was empty, but because it felt deliberate, like a shield she'd built to survive. By the second day, she ventured outside. Elias found her near the fence line, fingers grazing the wood, as though testing if the world was real. She didn't walk far. When she saw him watching, she stopped. "I used to see skies like this when I was little," she said softly, "before everything turned to cages." He didn't reply. Sometimes the best thing you can give someone is room to breathe. In the evening, Clara helped gather kindling. Her steps were slow but purposeful. When she stumbled, Elias offered his arm. She didn't take it, but she didn't pull away either. Small victories, he thought. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara began to speak in pieces. "Marble Pass Station," she murmured. "They told us there'd be work, food, maybe a better life." Her voice broke, and she stared at the flames as if they were listening. "They lined us up like cattle. I didn't smile. That's why they—" She stopped, fingers clutching the red scarf. Elias didn't push her to finish. He just fed another log to the fire, the crackle filling the space where words failed. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were steady. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't for the food or the roof over her head. It was for the fact that, for the first time in days, or maybe years, someone had seen her face without turning away. Outside, the sky had darkened to velvet. A lone coyote howled in the distance. Elias knew trouble wasn't far. But tonight, under this roof, the girl was safe, and that was enough. By the third day, the silence of Ashwood Flats had begun to hum with whispers. Elias heard it when he rode into town for a sack of flour. Men leaned against the rail outside the general store, talking in low tones that carried just far enough. "Boone's got himself a girl," one muttered. "Not a girl," another corrected. "A curse. Heard she's Comanche." Or worse. Elias kept his head down, tying off the reins as though he hadn't heard a word. Inside the store, the chatter followed him like a shadow. Mrs. Whitmore caught his eye from behind the counter. Her gaze softened, but her lips tightened in warning. "They're talking," she whispered. "You best be careful. A man like you, living alone, folks are quick to imagine the worst." Elias paid for his flour without a reply. He'd learned long ago that talk couldn't mend fences or feed cattle. But as he rode back home, a knot tightened in his gut. Words had a way of turning into trouble if left unchecked. That evening, the wind carried more than just dust. It carried footsteps, slow, deliberate, and paired with the dull thud of hooves. Elias stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting against the doorframe. Two riders approached, their silhouettes black against the fading light. The first man reined his horse a few yards from the fence. "Looking for a girl," he called out. His voice was slick, like oil on water. "Red hair, wears a sack, I heard. Came limping this way." Elias didn't flinch. "Don't know anyone like that." The second rider, broader and meaner looking, spat into the dirt.
"Word is she's pretty under that sack. Pretty enough to fetch a price. We're here to take her back." Elias' jaw tightened. "She's not yours." The first man grinned, the kind of grin that never reached the eyes. "Everything's for sale out here, friend. Don't make this hard." Elias stepped forward, his boots sinking into the dust. "You're lost. Best turn around before nightfall." His hand rested lightly on the shotgun, not raised, but not idle either. The riders exchanged a glance. Something in Elias' stance, calm, firm, unshaken, made them pause. The first man laughed under his breath, though it sounded forced. "We'll be back," he said. "No one keeps what don't belong to them." Elias didn't answer. He waited until they turned their horses and rode back down the south road, their figures swallowed by the twilight. Inside the cabin, Clara sat near the fire, her fingers twisting the red scarf. She'd heard everything. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "They'll come again." "Maybe," Elias said, "but they won't find what they're looking for." Clara's gaze flicked to the shotgun resting by the door. "Why would you risk this? You don't even know me." Elias looked at her, the shadows from the fire dancing across his face. "I know enough." Something in the way he said it, firm, final, made her stop asking. She nodded once, as if accepting that this ranch, for now, was a place where the world couldn't reach her. That night, the ranch felt different. The crickets were quieter, the wind sharper. Clara couldn't sleep, every creak of the cabin pulling her from uneasy dreams. Elias stayed up by the fire, checking the shotgun, eyes fixed on the door. He wasn't a man who sought out fights, but he knew how to end them if they came too close. As the last embers of the fire burned low, Clara whispered from the corner, "You don't have to protect me." Elias glanced at her, his voice a quiet rumble. "Maybe not, but I will." The next morning broke with a quiet stillness, the kind that made every sound feel sharper, like the world was listening. Elias was on the porch mending a harness when he noticed Clara standing by the edge of the yard, her red scarf catching the breeze. She wasn't looking at the fence or the sky. She was looking inward, as if she were trying to remember who she was before the sack, before the bruises. When she saw him watching, she turned away quickly, heading back into the cabin. He followed a few minutes later and found her sitting at the table, holding something fragile in her hands, an old leather-bound book. "It was hers, wasn't it?" she asked. Elias paused. He knew the book well, the cracked spine, the soft edges. It was his mother's Bible, untouched for years except when he dusted the shelf. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "She read it every evening. Said it kept the dark from settling too deep." Clara traced the faded gold letters with her finger. "I never learned to read," she admitted, her voice soft. "Not properly, but I can tell it's important." "It was to her," Elias replied. "Still is, I guess." They sat in silence for a while, the fire snapping softly in the hearth. Then Clara spoke again, not looking at him. "Do you believe in hell?" Elias considered the question. "I believe people can make hell," he said slowly. "I saw it in the war. Not fire and brimstone, but the kind of darkness that gets inside a man and hollows him out." Clara nodded, her eyes distant.
"That's what they tried to do to me," she whispered. "Turn me into something empty, a ghost." Elias set down the harness he'd been working on and met her gaze. "They didn't succeed." She gave him a sad smile. "Not yet, but sometimes I feel like they left pieces of me behind, like I'm still wearing that sack even when I'm not." Elias leaned back, the firelight throwing deep shadows across his weathered face. "I don't see a ghost," he said quietly. "I see someone still standing. That takes more strength than most men I know." Clara looked down, clutching the Bible to her chest as though it were a shield. "Do you think God still sees me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Elias was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think he does, and I think he's the reason you're still here." Her eyes softened, shimmering under the firelight. "You sound like you believe that." "I've seen worse men than me crawl out of places darker than this," Elias said, "and I've seen mercy in the smallest things. Sometimes that's all you need to believe again." That night, Clara sat near the hearth, turning the Bible over in her hands. She didn't open it, but she held it like something warm and alive. Elias sat across from her, not speaking, just watching the glow of the fire reflect in her eyes. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was shared, like two people listening for the same distant note neither could name. Before heading to bed, Clara placed the Bible carefully on the table and looked at Elias. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me. For not looking away." Elias didn't reply. But as he watched her walk to the small bed in the corner, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about finding something he thought he'd lost years ago, a piece of his own faith buried beneath the dust of silence. The night they came back, the air felt wrong. Even the crickets had gone quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elias was sitting by the fire, sharpening the edge of his old hunting knife, when the low rumble of hooves rolled across the valley. He stood up slowly, the chair creaking under his weight, and reached for the shotgun mounted above the hearth. "Stay inside," he said to Clara without looking at her. His voice was calm, but his eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Clara froze where she stood. She had heard that sound before, men riding not with purpose, but with malice. Her hand tightened around the red scarf on the table. "Is it them?" Elias nodded once. "Silas Crane." By the time Elias stepped onto the porch, 4 riders had gathered at the fence line. They didn't bother hiding who they were. Lantern light flickered off their faces, hard, cruel, marked by lives spent taking rather than earning. Silas Crane dismounted first, tall and wiry, with eyes that looked like they'd been carved from cold steel. "Well," Silas drawled, "I hear you've got something that doesn't belong to you, Boone." "She's not yours," Elias said. Silas smirked, showing a row of teeth too white for a man like him. "She's bought property, and you don't get to keep what's already paid for." Elias didn't move. His shotgun rested loosely in his grip, but his stance was steady as a mountain. "You'll ride out now," Silas chuckled, glancing at the men behind him. "You think you can scare me with that? You're a good man, Boone. Good men hesitate. Me? I don't." Inside the cabin, Clara stood near the door, heart pounding. She could hear every word, every mocking tone that Silas used. Something in her chest tightened, not fear, but fury. For too long they'd made her feel like less than human. For too long she'd hidden. She opened the door. Barefoot, wrapped in Elias's old quilt, Clara stepped into the lantern light. The men stopped laughing. Even Silas blinked, just for a second. "Why are you afraid of me?" Clara's voice was soft, but it carried like the wind. She stepped forward, her bruises still visible, but her back straight. "You beat me. You sold me. You said I'd bring ruin. But look at you, trembling." Silas's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, but Clara didn't back down. The firelight caught the red scarf tied loosely around her wrist, making it glow like a brand of defiance. "You don't own me," she said. "You never did." Elias raised the shotgun slightly. "You hurt her. Now ride." Silas looked at him, then at Clara, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. For a moment, it seemed he might push his luck, but then he spat into the dirt and turned away. "This ain't over," he muttered, mounting his horse. "It is," Elias said. His voice was low, final. The four men rode off into the darkness, the sound of their horses fading into the night. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her breath coming in short bursts. When she realized her hands were shaking, she clenched them tight until the trembling stopped. Elias stepped closer, lowering the shotgun. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "I did," she whispered. "I needed them to see my face." Elias looked at her for a long moment, seeing not a broken girl, but someone who had just taken the first step out of the grave others tried to dig for her. The days after Silas's retreat carried a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy silence of fear anymore. It was something lighter, like the air after a storm. Clara moved through the cabin differently, no longer hugging the walls, no longer shrinking from every creak of the floorboards. She started opening the windows in the morning to let sunlight in, as though testing if warmth could replace the shadows. One morning, Elias found her outside, standing by the fence line with a bucket in her hands. "I can help," she said, her voice steady but still soft. She was barefoot, the red scarf tied loosely at her wrist, the bruises on her face fading to faint traces. "You don't have to," Elias replied, adjusting a loose plank. "I want to," she said, handing him nails without waiting for permission. It wasn't much, a few nails, a bit of wood, but something about her standing there, sleeves rolled up, meant more than words. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was choosing to live. Later that week, Elias saw her laugh for the first time. It was small and quiet, but it caught him off guard, like the sound of a bell after a long winter. A stubborn hen had pecked at her boot as she tried to scatter feed, and she let out a breathy laugh that made him pause mid-step. He didn't say anything, but he smiled, something he hadn't done in months. Clara noticed. "What?" she asked, brushing hay from her skirt. "Nothing," Elias said, shaking his head. "It's just good to hear." She didn't reply, but her smile lingered long after he turned away. That evening, Elias went to a small drawer built into the wall of the cabin. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside lay a pair of leather gloves, hand-stitched and worn smooth by use. They had belonged to his mother, the woman who taught him that the land only belongs to those willing to care for it. He held them for a moment before walking to the fire where Clara sat, brushing out her tangled hair. "These were hers," he said, holding the gloves out. Clara looked up, surprised. "I can't—" "You can," Elias interrupted gently. "I think she'd want you to have them." Clara hesitated, then slid her hands into the gloves. They didn't fit perfectly, but close enough. She flexed her fingers, the leather creaking softly. For the first time, she looked like she belonged, not just in the cabin, but in the life Elias had built. That night they sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Clara rested her elbows on her knees, the gloves still on her hands. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if you're allowed to start over, or if some things follow you no matter where you go?" Elias thought about that for a long moment. "I think we all carry something," he said. But sometimes, if you hold on to the right things, the wrong ones start to fade. Clara looked at him then, eyes soft but determined. "Maybe this is one of those right things," she whispered. Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. It was a late afternoon when the wagon appeared on the trail, a dark shape moving slowly across the horizon. Elias spotted it first from the porch. He narrowed his eyes, hand instinctively brushing the shotgun by the door. But as the wagon drew closer, he saw no threat, only a thin, weary woman at the reins and a small child curled up beside her. Clara stepped outside, shading her eyes. Something in her breath caught. "I know her," she whispered. When the wagon stopped at the gate, the woman looked up. Her face was pale, hollow from exhaustion, but her eyes, soft brown eyes, met Clara's like they'd already shared a lifetime of pain. "Clara?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "Liddy," Clara replied, almost too softly to hear. She hurried forward, her bare feet kicking up dust. The two women embraced, clinging to each other as if afraid the other might vanish like smoke. The child stirred, no older than 4, and Clara crouched down to smile at her. "Ruth," Liddy said, stroking the girl's hair. "She's mine." Elias watched silently, his hand loosening from the shotgun. When Liddy turned toward him, her voice cracked. "I heard you might be here, Clara. They told me you were gone, that you—" "They tried," Clara said gently, "but someone stopped them." She glanced back at Elias, who said nothing but gave a small nod. Liddy swallowed hard. "I don't have a place anymore. He left us, took the money, the wagon's near falling apart, and I've got no safe road ahead." Clara turned to Elias, her eyes pleading but quiet. Elias didn't hesitate. "There's room," he said, motioning toward the barn. "Hayloft's warm, and we've got enough to share." Liddy's shoulders sagged with relief. She climbed down from the wagon, tears running silently down her cheeks. Not loud, not desperate, but the kind of tears that come when fear finally loosens its grip. Clara helped her carry Ruth inside, tucking the girl under one of Elias's old quilts by the fire. That evening, the cabin felt different, fuller. Ruth sat on Clara's lap, tracing the stitching on the red scarf. Liddy sat close to the fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee Elias had offered. "Clara told me about Marble Pass," Liddy said after a long silence. "We were there together, before they split us up. I thought I'd never see her again." Elias nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You're safe here now." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Liddy looked at him, and for a moment, something like hope flickered in her tired eyes. Later that night, when Ruth had fallen asleep in Clara's arms, Elias stepped outside to check the fences. Clara followed, holding the red scarf like a small flag in her hand. "She needs this place," Clara said quietly, "just like I do." Elias studied her for a moment before answering. "Then she stays. Both of you do." Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. For the first time, she felt like this wasn't just a safe house. It was becoming something stronger, a home. Inside, Liddy was already settling in. She'd found a needle and thread among Elias's supplies and had begun stitching a quilt from scraps of fabric. "Ruth likes the sound of the wind here," she said softly to Clara. "It doesn't sound mean like the places we've been." Clara squeezed her hand. "It won't here. Not anymore." That night, 3 people slept under the same roof, and for once, none of them dreamed of cages or fear. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The morning sky was pale, washed in gold and gray when Clara stepped outside carrying the sack. For days she had avoided looking at it, but now she held it with steady hands, no longer trembling. Elias stood by the fence, mending a loose wire, watching her from the corner of his eye. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just knew.
Clara walked to the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the ranch, the one with roots like deep scars pressed into the earth. She stopped beneath its branches, the sack clutched against her chest, and looked up. The breeze whispered through the leaves, tugging at the hem of her dress, as if urging her to let go. She lifted the sack and hooked it onto a low branch. It swung gently, like a ghost finally laid to rest. For a long moment she stared at it, not with fear, but with something close to defiance. This was the thing they used to erase her, to make her feel invisible, less than human.
Now it was nothing but a piece of old burlap swaying in the wind. Elias walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "You sure?" he asked softly. Clara nodded. "It's not mine anymore." She reached up, fingers brushing the rough fabric one last time, then stepped back. The sunlight slipped through the branches, casting warm stripes across her face. She turned to Elias, and for the first time she didn't lower her gaze. Her eyes were clear, like someone who had stopped running. Later, she found a shallow pool near the fence line. The water was still, reflecting her face as if the earth itself was holding up a mirror. She knelt beside it, hands hovering above the surface. For months, maybe years, she had been afraid of her own reflection, afraid it would show her the broken, unwanted girl they said she was. But the face that looked back at her was not weak. The bruises had faded, leaving faint reminders of a fight she had survived. She leaned closer, tracing her features with her eyes, and smiled. A small, uncertain smile, but real. When Elias approached, he didn't speak. He just stood beside her, looking at the reflection of them both in the water. Clara dipped her hands into the pool, letting the coolness wash over her scars. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said quietly. Elias nodded once, his voice steady. "I know." The days after Clara hung the sack were softer. Something in the air shifted around the ranch, as if the land itself recognized her quiet victory. Elias noticed it first in the way she moved. She walked with a straighter back now, no longer glancing over her shoulder as if expecting shadows to follow her. They began sharing meals at the small wooden table by the hearth. At first, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken things. But over time, it became something else, a silence that felt alive, like the space between notes in a song. Clara would slice bread while Elias poured coffee, their hands brushing occasionally, neither of them pulling away. One evening, after a day spent repairing the north fence, Elias returned to find Clara standing on the porch, her hair loose and glowing in the late sunlight. She looked at him, a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. Instead, she held out a tin cup of water. He took it, their fingers grazing, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them standing there in the fading light. As night fell, they sat near the fire, the sound of crackling wood filling the cabin. Clara traced the edge of her red scarf absent-mindedly before turning to Elias. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Am I still a ghost to you?" Elias paused, the weight of her words sinking in. He set his cup down and looked at her, really looked at her, the firelight painting soft shadows across her face. "No," he said slowly, "you're the reason I stopped being one." Clara's breath caught, her eyes glistening but steady. She didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames. Then, with a kind of quiet courage, she reached out and placed her hand on his. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of every moment they had shared, every unspoken promise that had taken root between them. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the cabin felt warm, alive. Elias tightened his hand around hers, a simple acknowledgement that neither of them was alone anymore. For the first time in years, he felt the walls of his grief begin to crumble, replaced by something tender and real. Word travels fast in Ashwood Flats. By the time a week had passed, the town was buzzing with talk of Silas Crane and the things he'd done. It wasn't just Clara's story anymore. Other voices began to whisper too. A drifter mentioned a missing girl near Marble Pass. An old ranch hand muttered about deals gone bad and girls who never made it home. Elias heard the rumors when he went into town for feed. No one spoke to him directly, but he caught the sidelong glances, the way conversation stopped when he walked past. He didn't care for gossip, but he knew this kind of talk was dangerous for Silas and for anyone who got in his way. That evening, a cloud of dust rose on the southern road. It wasn't Silas this time, but Sheriff Miles riding alone, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare. He dismounted slowly, his boots thudding on the dry ground, and walked toward the porch where Elias was repairing a lantern. "Boone," the sheriff said, tipping his hat slightly. His voice was rough but not unfriendly.
"Heard you had some trouble out here. Trouble has a way of finding me." Miles leaned on the porch railing, his eyes scanning the quiet yard. "Silas Crane's name is coming up too often for my liking. Folks are starting to see him for what he is." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "I heard what you did. Standing your ground. You did right." Elias finally met his eyes. "Wasn't about being right. Was about keeping her safe." The sheriff nodded once. "Keep doing that. And don't worry, Silas won't be darkening your doorstep again, not with the town watching." Inside the cabin, Clara had been listening from the window. When she stepped out, the sheriff tipped his hat to her, a quiet sign of respect. It was the first time anyone from town had looked at her without suspicion or fear. She gave a small nod, clutching the red scarf in her hands. As the sheriff rode away, Elias felt something loosen in his chest. The weight of silence that had hung over the ranch for weeks seemed lighter now. Clara stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "They believe me now," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "They believe the truth."
That's enough. For the first time, Clara felt that her name and her face was no longer a curse whispered in shadows. A few days after the sheriff's visit, Clara sat alone on the porch, the red scarf resting in her lap. The morning sun spilled over the fields, turning the grass a pale gold. Elias was nearby, tending to the horses, but his eyes occasionally drifted toward her. There was something different in the way she held herself now, quieter but not fragile. She spoke without looking up. "I've been thinking," she said, "about my name." Elias wiped his hands on a rag, leaning against the fence. "What about it?" "It doesn't feel like mine anymore," Clara admitted. "That name, it belongs to the girl they tried to break, the girl who stood in the dirt with a sack on her head. I'm not her now." Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. "So what name feels like yours?" Clara hesitated, fingers twisting the scarf. "Grace," she whispered. "Clara Grace." The name hung in the air like a prayer, soft but unshakable. Elias said it once, testing the sound. "Clara Grace." He smiled slightly. "It suits you." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the pale morning sky. "You think so?" "I do," he said, "because you're not just surviving anymore. You've found something stronger, something worth carrying." Clara's breath hitched as if the words reached some hidden place in her chest. She stood and walked to the fence where Elias stood. "Say it again," she murmured. "Clara Grace," he repeated, slower this time, like he was carving the name into the air for good. Later that afternoon, Clara found the old sack still swaying from the oak tree. She untied it, folded it carefully, and carried it to the garden. Without a word, she dug a small hole beneath the cottonwood tree and buried it, pressing the earth flat with her palms. When she stood, her hands were dirty, but her face was bright. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Elias watched from the porch. He didn't say anything, but his chest swelled with something he couldn't name. Pride, maybe? Or the quiet relief of watching someone choose life over fear. That evening, as the sun melted into the hills, Clara stood by the door and whispered to herself, "My name is Clara Grace." She liked the way it sounded, like freedom. Spring came quietly, softening the harsh edges of the land. The fields around Elias's ranch turned green, and wildflowers began to bloom along the fence line. Clara spent her mornings tending to the garden with Liddy and Ruth, her laughter occasionally floating back to where Elias worked by the barn. It was a sound he'd grown to look forward to, as much as the sunrise. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Elias broke the silence. "You ever think about staying here, for good?" His voice was steady, but his hand gripped the armrest of his chair just a little too tightly. Clara turned to him, studying his weathered face. "I already am," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "But do you mean staying or belonging?" Elias met her gaze. Both. The wedding, if you could call it that, wasn't planned in any formal way. There was no preacher, no papers, just the warm light of a spring evening, Liddy and Ruth standing by, and Elias in his best clean shirt. Clara wore a simple white linen dress that Liddy had stitched with care, and Ruth scattered cedar branches along the porch steps like it was the finest chapel. Elias looked at Clara, his voice low and sure. "I never thought I'd have more than fences and horses," he said. "But you changed all that." Clara smiled, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for his. "I never thought I'd be anything but the girl in the sack," she whispered. "But you saw me. You always saw me." There were no vows spoken, no grand speeches, just a quiet moment when Elias took her hand and kissed her forehead, and she knew she wasn't just safe, she was home. Liddy smiled through tears, and Ruth clapped her little hands, too young to understand, but sensing the warmth in the air. That night, as the stars rose over Ashwood Flats, the cabin felt alive with something new. The walls that once held silence and grief now held laughter and the steady rhythm of two people who had decided to walk forward together. Outside, the land smelled of rain and fresh earth, a promise of good seasons ahead. The months that followed were kind to the land. Rain came when it was needed, and the soil responded with green pastures and steady harvests. Clara moved through the days with quiet grace, her hands no longer trembling, her eyes no longer shadowed by fear. By the time summer came, the cabin felt like a real home, full of voices, warmth, and the smell of fresh bread. When Clara told Elias she was expecting, he simply wrapped his arms around her, his rough hands resting against her back. He didn't speak at first, just breathed, as if letting the truth settle deep into his bones. "She'll be strong," he finally murmured, "like her mother." The birth came on a warm spring morning, with the sun spilling across the fields like liquid gold. Liddy stayed by Clara's side, guiding her through every breath, while Elias paced outside the cabin, his boots wearing a line in the dirt. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the quiet, he stopped dead, his hands tightening around the porch rail. Liddy stepped outside, smiling despite the exhaustion in her face. "A girl," she said simply. Elias exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Clara lay inside, cradling the tiny bundle against her chest. "Mercy," she whispered when Elias knelt beside the bed. "Her name is Mercy, not because we were spared, but because we were given a chance to begin again." Elias brushed a finger along the baby's soft cheek. "Mercy Boone," he said, tasting the name like it was a blessing. In the days that followed, the ranch seemed to hum with a new energy. Ruth adored the baby, always sneaking peeks into the cradle, while Liddy stitched tiny blankets from leftover fabric. Clara would sit on the porch in the evenings, holding Mercy close as the sun dipped behind the hills. Elias often stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, both of them watching the land breathe in quiet peace. One evening, Clara whispered,
I used to believe my face brought ruin, that I was cursed." She looked at Elias, her smile tender but strong. "But then you saw me, and you never looked away." Elias didn't answer with words. He just leaned in, kissed her forehead, and watched Mercy sleep. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Years passed quietly on the Boone Ranch. The land that had once been a harsh, lonely stretch of earth now felt alive, softened by the laughter of children and the hum of daily work. Clara Grace, as everyone in town now called her, moved through the seasons with a kind of calm strength. She was no longer the girl in the sack. She was a woman who had built something that would last beyond her years. The people of Ashwood Flats had changed too.
At first, they spoke of her in whispers, unsure of what to make of the red-haired girl who had appeared like a ghost. But time and resilience have a way of changing hearts. Clara became known for her quiet kindness, leaving a loaf of bread at a neighbor's door, mending a child's torn sleeve, or offering a warm meal to the drifters passing through. Children began calling her Miss Grace, not out of formality, but out of respect. Some of them even sought her stories, asking about the days when life was harder and the world seemed colder. She never told them everything, never spoke of Silas or the sack, but she told them about finding courage when it seemed lost, and about how even the smallest act of kindness, like taking the sack off, could change a life. On the edge of the ranch, the old oak tree stood as it always had, its roots deep in the earth. Beneath it, half buried in the dirt, lay the remains of that burlap sack. Over time, the wind tore it apart, and the earth reclaimed it, leaving behind only scraps. Sometimes, when the sun was low and the shadows long, Clara would stand under that oak, one hand resting on the trunk, and remember.
Not with pain, but with a kind of gratitude. "You see that tree?" she once told Mercy, who was no older than 5 at the time. "It's where I stopped being afraid." Mercy tilted her head, looking up at her mother with wide, curious eyes. "What happened there?" Clara smiled softly. "I let something go that was never meant for me to carry." Elias watched Clara grow stronger with every passing year. She had become the heart of their home, the reason the place felt like more than just land and fences. He often caught her humming softly as she worked, her voice blending with the wind that rolled across the hills. One spring morning, as they sat together on the porch, Elias looked out at the blooming fields and said, "You know, I used to think this land was all I had, just dirt and fences. But now," he paused, turning toward her, "now I see it's alive because of you." Clara reached for his hand, her fingers warm and sure. "We made it alive," she corrected, "together." By then, Liddy and Ruth had made the ranch their home as well. Liddy sewed quilts out of old shirts and canvas scraps, while Ruth chased chickens in the yard, her laughter ringing like a bell. The place no longer felt like it belonged to just one man. It was a home for anyone who needed a place to start over. The seasons turned, each one softer than the last. Clara often walked the fields at sunset, her red scarf trailing behind her like a banner of freedom. She had survived the worst of storms and had come out standing. And in the quiet of those evenings, as the sky turned to fire and gold, she would close her eyes and whisper, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for giving her another chance." Clara Grace lived to see many springs turn to summer, and many summers fade into autumn. Time softened her hair to silver, but never dimmed the warmth in her eyes. Even in her later years, she walked the ranch with a quiet authority, her hands steady, her voice calm. Mercy grew into a strong young woman with the same fiery hair as her mother and the same determination that once made Clara stand barefaced before the world. The townsfolk who once whispered cruelly now greeted Clara with smiles and kindness. They called her a blessing, someone who reminded them that strength could be gentle and courage didn't have to shout.
She had become a pillar of the community, not because she sought it, but because she lived with a kind of grace that demanded respect. Elias, older now, never stopped looking at her the way he did that first day he pulled the sack from her head, with quiet awe. Sometimes, in the evenings, they sat together on the porch, holding hands, saying little. Words weren't necessary. They had already said all that mattered in the way they lived. When Clara passed away, it was on a spring morning much like the one she first arrived at the ranch. The fields were alive with color, and the wind carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. She slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Elias holding her hand until the last moment. There was no large funeral, no procession, just a small gathering of those who loved her most. They buried her under the cottonwood tree near the garden, the same place where she once buried the old sack. On the stone, Elias carved himself. There were only 5 words. She took it off forever. Mercy, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, laid a hawk feather beside the grave. She was never meant to wear that sack, she whispered. She was always meant to fly. Years later, Ruth and Mercy, now grown women, often found themselves telling Clara's story. They didn't tell it as a tale of sorrow, but as one of triumph. They spoke of how a young woman once cast aside found the courage to rise, how she built a life out of dust and silence. One evening, Mercy sat on the porch with her own daughter, the golden light of dusk painting the hills. The little girl picked up a feather near the fence post, holding it up with curiosity. "Mama, what does it mean?" Mercy smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It means freedom," she said. "It means there was once a woman who decided she wouldn't live hidden anymore, and because of her, we all learned what it means to truly live." Elias lived for several more years after Clara's passing. He never remarried, but his life wasn't lonely. The ranch stayed alive, cared for by Mercy and Ruth's families. Sometimes he would sit beneath the cottonwood tree, tracing the letters on Clara's stone with his rough fingers. "You were right," he'd whisper. "You were always more." When he passed, they buried him beside her, their graves resting under the same wide branches. And every spring, when the wind rustled the leaves, the family swore it sounded like her laughter, soft, unbroken, and free. If Clara's story stirred something deep in you, memories, hope, or the quiet strength we all carry, stay with us. Our True Wild West Story series brings you tales of resilience, love, and humanity beneath the wide frontier sky. Subscribe and let every story rekindle the fire of your own heart.